Thank you so much for coming today. Today we'll be having Professor Steve Keen, and we'll be talking about if we should get rid of neoclassical economics. We'll be talking about if the models that we are using, are they actually true? And also, can we use sound economic policies to avoid the next financial crisis?
Our guest today has made it his life's work to challenge economic orthodoxy, quite loudly so. He's the author of Debunking Economics and the New Economics and Manifesto. Despite being one of the few who publicly predicted the 2008 financial crisis, Keen is not just a prophet of doom. He's actually an architect of a new paradigm, a shift towards which he strongly advocates for.
I'm currently holding his new book. He's written that a few years ago. We'll be exploring this book. We'll be talking about topics like, should we just get completely rid of neoclassical economics? He'll probably say yes. We'll be talking about the private debt to GDP ratio. Is it really that problematic? And lastly, are the textbooks that we are learning here at university about economics, are they just fantasy? Without further ado, please welcome Professor Steve Keen.
Okay, good to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you.
Okay, thank you. The red and blue lines for the questions and answers.
Yes, that's how we divide the questions. And I'll be actually starting off with the first question. Welcome back. We've had you around 8 years ago.
I think 8 years ago, yeah.
A lot has changed since then. In addition, a new book, which I've already
more
shown.
More chaos in the global economy and society, yeah.
That's true as well. Your new book is called The New Economics, and it's also called a Manifesto. Why is it called a Manifesto?
Intriguingly enough, it was supposed to be called Economics Matters because the publisher that I put this through has been a fan of my work for a long time, and they had a series called Philosophy Matters Because and Mathematics Matters Because, and so on, that they were selling to school students. And I said, look, I reckon economics doesn't matter, we should get rid of it, you know. And he said, no, don't worry, I put the proposal forward. He snuck it under the radar, and then when it got into the accepted, he said, let's change the title. And he suggested the manifesto.
And
so in a sense, what a manifesto is a statement of intent. Okay? It's your declaration, and that's what this book amounts to, a declaration about what economics should be, rather than what it is.
And who are you trying to convince?
I'm not bothering with economists. It's impossible to convince economists to change their mind. It's a bit like trying to persuade... imagine if you went to the Vatican as an archaeologist and said, I've been digging in Israel and I found the tomb of Jesus Christ. Would you like to see the body? The next body you look at is your own after you get killed by the Vatican guards. They don't want to know that something fundamental to their beliefs is false. Mm-hmm. So I've given up on talking with them. I'll irritate them if necessary on occasions. But the main people I'm trying to read are young students like yourselves and people outside economics, particularly journalists and politicians. But the trouble is everybody's absorbed their supply and demand analysis. So it's just like, and I'm not saying I'm in the same rank as Galileo, but it's like being Galileo trying to persuade people that the Earth is in fact not the centre of the universe. And that's the difficulty you've got, because you say it's not, and they say, well, that's crazy. You know, if I throw a rock up on the ground, it comes straight back down. Why does it come back down if it's not the centre of the universe? You say we spin. If we're spinning, why isn't the wind 1,000 kilometres, or whatever they called it back then, 1,000 kilometres an hour, etc., etc. So you're not only fighting against a discipline which is entrenched, its image of how the world operates has been entrenched in people as well through culture, media, the importance of economics as a topic. So I just give up on persuading a neoclassical to change their spots, but it's possible to reach other people who often are aware of something must be wrong with economics, but they're not quite sure what, so I'm trying to answer what that is.
Okay, and how was the book received?
Pretty well. It's been translated into Italian, German, Thai at the moment. I think there's a couple of other languages coming, and sold quite well, but the trouble is, like a textbook like Mankew's Macroeconomics will sell millions of copies. So in terms of volume, you have no chance of competing against that.
Yes, so for the last 30 years, you know, you've been kind of destroying neoclassical economics, kind of saying we have to get rid of it. Well, let's flip the script. Could you maybe strongman or steelman the case for neoclassical economics? If you can give like a 1-minute pitch, like the strongest arguments for neoclassical economics.
For it or against it?
For it, yes. We're flipping the script.
Well, it's easy to understand than the story of Jesus Christ. You take the cross and tilt it 90 degrees and you've got neoclassical economics. I'm sorry. It was something which was a persuasive perspective on how the economy operates in the 19th century. Because if you look at how economics has developed over time, the fundamental dichotomy has been people who believe that it's about free exchange. Okay, market economies, people voluntarily exchange one thing for another. And then the question is, what's the basis of that exchange? Is it the subjective utility of the two things which are being swapped, or is it the effort involved in making those two things? So that's the dividing line between all the theories of economics. And if you go back to the early days of economics, and I date that back to the physiocrats in France before the classical school, the emphasis was that the cost of production is what determines price. Okay? And the idea that the subjective utility that a buyer gets out of a product was regarded as irrelevant. Okay? And then what has happened with neoclassical, that flipped over. So the people who say the exchange ratio reflects effort are now the minority, and the majority say it's subjective utility. So I can understand the appeal, and it all seemed to fit together very nicely in the 19th century. So if you go back 150 years, I can defend it. Mm-hmm. But if you look what has happened since then, and I'm talking about the mathematics fundamentally, mathematical economists, mathematicians who aren't economists, have all found fundamental flaws in the logic, and they continue on regardless. So if I had to think of an image of what neoclassical economics is today, have you heard of what's called a juggernaut?
A juggernaut?
Juggernaut, okay?
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's part of the Hindu religion, this crazy device that shouldn't go forward but does. Okay? It's part of a lot of Hindu ceremonies. Mm-hmm. Neoclassical economics is like that. It's a juggernaut you can't stop, but it shouldn't be moving at the same time. So I'm afraid I really can't defend it. I can defend it in naivety, but I can't defend it in modern circumstances.
So your strongman case or steelman case for neoclassical economics is that it's kind of believable. That's the only good thing.
Yeah, it's superficially convincing, and that's why it gets such wide appeal. And then it describes a perfect society, which is why I think the people who become academic economists and people like Austrian economists who politically lobby, it's a very seductive vision because fundamentally it's a perfect anarchist society. It doesn't need a government. Okay? It works better with the government's not there. Everything's voluntary exchange. You reach equilibrium, and that's got to be good. Equilibrium's got to be a marvellous place. And you get your utility maximised subject to the cost of providing that utility. So it's a perfect, and also you get paid what you deserve, you get your marginal product. Okay? All these things make it a very seductive vision of a perfectly functioning society. And that's a very seductive vision. And if that vision gets undermined by logical or empirical flaws, people end up turning a blind eye to that, and the juggernaut continues on.
Yeah, so you precisely criticize this assumption of neoclassical models on these rational, utility-maximizing agents operating in an equilibrium.
Well, yeah, but even the way they define rational, I mean, if you look at how the word rational is defined by a neoclassical economist, and you start, the very first definition was John Muth in a paper in 1961, criticising what's called the cobweb model that explains cycles in prices and quantities of agricultural products by having a supply and demand curve. You start off out of equilibrium and you bounce around it like a cobweb. Okay? Well, he rejected that and said, no, people have a model in their heads of the economy. And he literally said that information is scarce and the society generally does not waste it. Therefore, people use a model to predict the future. They've got an accurate way of predicting the future. Now, if you show that definition to somebody who doesn't know what the word you're defining and ask them which word in the dictionary have I defined, their answer would be prophetic. So what they see as rational is actually the capacity for accurate prophecy. Okay? So they end up distorting the language in that way. I'm not going to pretend everybody's either Nostradamus or Jesus Christ. But that fundamentally, when you say rational expectations, you mean people who can see what is going to happen in the system they're in, and therefore counter any ill effects that might come from government action. So it's a crazy definition of rational.
But at the same time, rationality, like, it's an assumption that people are rational, and what neoclassical economics does is we make assumptions, right? Like, we simplify something in order to model it. So everyone here knows the supply and demand curve. We all know it. It goes like this. You cross the intersection.
Yeah.
Like, is there not any value in even models like this? Like, we have to simplify it to some extent.
I'll give a bit of a cameo. I gave a talk at the Western Economic Association Americas when it was actually held in Australia. That's taking Western to an extreme distance. And there was a young neoclassical, this is after the financial crisis, very enthusiastically explaining his dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. And I went to his session and I thought, it'll be fun if he comes to mine. Well, he didn't. He sat in the front row, basically where cars are sitting there right now. And he finally couldn't contain himself when I was going through my model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. And he finally blurted out, but you're assuming people are idiots. And I said, well, did you predict the financial crisis? He said, no. I said, well, on that basis, you're an idiot. Why shouldn't I model the world as consisting of people like you? Then he chased me out of the room, continue the conversation. There's no point talking to him. So he said, but we have to make some simplifying assumptions. And I just said over my shoulder, mate, you've got to learn the difference between a simplifying assumption and a fantasy. Now, if you look at what's involved in the theory of demand, they're fantasies, not simplifying assumptions.
But how is it a fantasy if, for example, it captures some real associations between price and demand?
No, it doesn't. For example, the classic is the supply curve. You've all done the idea of diminishing marginal productivity, therefore rising marginal cost. Okay? There have been 71, I think now, surveys done of manufacturing firms to ask them whether they experience diminishing marginal productivity or not. In other words, whether they have a rising marginal cost curve. Guess how many percentage of firms answer that is what they experience? It's between 1 and 11%, depending on the survey. Okay? 89 to 99% of firms say they have constant or falling marginal cost. So, and what goes on here, it's something that Schumpeter called the Ricardian vice. You make a set of assumptions which leave the conclusions you wish to reach as the only viable conclusions. So it's something you do in that model, and you're not even conscious of it most likely, is you assume homogeneous products. Okay? You assume a particular market, everybody's making the same thing, and therefore the only way they can compete is on price, and then you assume everybody knows the price every firm is charging, so you can only get an equilibrium price, etc., etc. Okay, the simple way to counter that, can anybody tell me the equilibrium price for a car?
You can shout it out if you want.
It's a stupid question, isn't it?
Yeah.
What am I talking about? Am I talking a Lamborghini or am I talking a Prada?
Yeah.
Okay? There's no such thing as a homogeneous product. Okay? Even in vegetables, you know. I shop at Abu Hai rather than Dirk. I think it's Dirk, because Abu Hai buys better quality blueberries. Okay, blueberries aren't homogeneous, so there's nothing homogeneous on the planet. And the real strength of capitalism is the diversity it's created over time. The products we consume now are absolutely different to what was consumed 100 years ago. So diversity and diversification, that's, if anything, is the strength of capitalism. It's encouraging that. So what you find when you look at actual firms, they have constant variable cost per unit, or it falls because the factories are designed by engineers who basically they target maximum efficiency at 100% capacity. So those costs are constant or falling. Your fixed costs are falling as well, average fixed costs. The firm takes a markup on its variable cost and sets that markup to determine its price. You've got a horizontal price curve, list price. In other words, when you go shopping, even going for a supermarket, you don't see the price of blueberries rising because more people are buying them at the till. It's a set price. So you pay a list price as a cost per unit. The gap between price and variable cost is the change in profit. So rather than maximising profit where you equate marginal cost and marginal revenue, that point doesn't exist. Okay? Instead, you maximise profit by selling as many units as you can. So all the firms are competing to sell as many as they can. They know their rivals. You know, iPhone knows its rivals are Android phones. Okay? They're targeting particular competitors. They're trying to take market share away. So the macroeconomics sets the size of the market. Firms inside compete to take as much as they can. That's the real world, and that's what when you look at the empirical data, that gives you lots of small firms, a small number of large firms and a large number of small firms in virtually every industry. So that's what we should be looking at, whereas this neoclassical fantasy, which didn't even make sense in the 1870s, let alone now, diverts us from the real world.
So you therefore state that nothing is worth saving from neoclassical economics, and we're just wondering if such an approach isn't perhaps reductive when it dismisses research that drew on neoclassical economics and if has proven to be beneficial and policy relevant. So for example, research within game theory on kidney exchange mechanisms or school choice mechanisms, made improved outcomes for real people.
There are some elements of game theory where you talk about designs of different types of market structures, that sort of stuff. There's some value inside that. Virtually everything that's on macroeconomics is dangerous. It's the opposite of what you should do. So there are some little bits and pieces where people could continue on and change the working paradigm while still doing similar research. But in most of them, and certainly in macroeconomics, there's nothing that I would keep of the neoclassicals.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're saying that it could even be dangerous, but neoclassical economics, you mentioned, is demonstrably false. I think you have a good case. But at the same, I think you make a good case that neoclassical economics is false. But at the same time, if you look around universities, even our own university, we do still teach neoclassical economics. And then the question arises, if you know it better, if you have better models, why are they not part of the curriculum? Is it a failure on heterodox?
Well, it's the same reason that Galileo's models weren't taught by Ptolemaic astronomers. Okay, people often look for conspiracy theories to explain why a particular discipline will have a standard set of beliefs. It's not a conspiracy, it's the fact that people share an organising concept around which they do all their work. So I'll use the Ptolemy versus Copernicus example all the time. With the Ptolemaic system, you had to explain the movements you saw of the planets in the sky with the naked eye, using a model in which the Earth was the centre of the universe and all the heavenly objects orbited on circles, and those circles had circles on them. And that was incredibly hard, really complicated, challenging, intellectually stimulating, waste of time. Okay? But it engaged people for 1,500 years. So with the same thing with Galileo tried to teach it, and of course he didn't get imprisoned by the Inquisition. He was lucky on that front. But you get the idea driven away. And this is standard in all sciences. A dominant paradigm will exist. If there's a rival paradigm, it will not be taught by people from the dominant paradigm. So and I have had courses shut down in departments I've taught in before. I taught a course on Marxian economics at one stage. That was shut down by my department, despite its popularity. So this happens all the time.
Why was it shut down?
Huh?
Why was it shut down?
Well, there's a particular asshole involved, so I won't go into that story. His name was Conlon, C-O-N-L-O-N. His nickname left out one letter. So he wanted to get even with me. But the arbitrariness of what they teach rival perspectives is... And they believe they're justified. Because they're teaching what they believe is the truth. I must be a heretic. So and what happens is people like myself generally end up working in low-grade universities. So I began at the University of Sydney, which was the top-ranked university in the country. Went to the University of New South Wales, which was about the second or third. Worked at the University of Western Sydney, which is about, in global terms, about 200th. And then I worked at Kingston, which is about 850th, and deserves its ranking. And what happened is the non-orthodox academics found themselves working at low-grade universities, and then you don't necessarily get the students you want to teach, and you also have the precarity of your funding, because if a government funding change occurs that makes it easier for students to go to higher-ranking universities, you lose your department. And that's happened to me twice.
Yeah. So now we're going to move on to the models that you've developed, the alternative ones. And you've taken the falsification approach with the neoclassical models. how do you retain the same standard of empirical rigor and falsifiability with your own work?
Put it this way, one of the main arguments I make is the importance of credit, which is the change in private debt. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, you just go and watch any television show you like about the economy, all the shows talk will be about the dangers of public debt. They don't even mention private debt. So one of my research areas is Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, and that argues that private debt and credit drives the economic system. When I did a correlation of credit, which is the annual change in private debt, to unemployment in America, according to Ben Bernanke, and I'll quote him from his book Essays on the Great Depression, he said that he called credit pure redistributions, because in the loanable funds model, one non-bank lends to another non-bank, the bank is just an intermediary. So that's a redistribution of money from you to you, okay? And he said, pure redistribution should have no significant macroeconomic effects, okay? Now, when I do the correlation of the rate of change of private debt as a percentage of GDP in America to the unemployment rate in America between 1990 and 2015, I get a correlation coefficient of minus 0.93. Now, call me crazy, but I think that's significantly different from zero, okay? So it's, you know, when I teach these courses, I'll often get into a new research area and I'll make an observation about the relationship that I expect. Then I go and grab the data and take a look at it. And I then have to tell my students that I would not dare make up empirical data for my case that is as strong as I find in the real data. It's like another example, for example, is and this also comes out of Minsky's thesis, the level of leverage, which you would be told if you do a standard finance course, the Modigliani-Miller hypothesis tells you that leverage will have no effect on the value of shares. Okay? Well, if you do a correlation of monthly data, there's 1,200 data points, in other words, in this series I'm talking about, monthly data of the S&P 500, change in the S&P 500, or you use the what's called the cyclically adjusted price to earnings ratio that Robert Shiller developed. I would keep some of Robert Shiller's work. Okay.
Hey, that's a win.
Okay,
Yeah.
so Robert did this index where he looked at the current price to the earnings over the previous 10 years to iron out any cyclical variation. He called it the CAPE, cyclically adjusted price to earnings ratio. If you look at the correlation of the CAPE, or the change in the CAPE, to change in the level of margin debt, correlation coefficient over 1,200 data points from 1925 to 2025 is 0.7. Now, again, I'd like to see any neoclassical who can get a correlation coefficient anywhere near what I'm finding in the data. So in that sense, I think we'd find a much stronger empirical foundation than they can do.
Yeah, so it seems that the neoclassical models kind of reject money. They see it as like neutral.
Yeah.
But nowadays we do have extensions to these. We have DSGE, which allows you to also incorporate money and credit into the models.
DSGE or
it is DSGE.
DSGE?
Yes.
A dynamic stochastic
Yes.
general equilibrium.
Just say the abbreviation, but that explains it fully.
None of those. There's only one person building DSG models that has credit in it. That's a guy called Michael Kumoff, who's the chief economist of the Bank of England. He's this weird friend of mine. He doesn't like the fact that I wear masks, so I haven't seen him since COVID. But he's the only neoclassical who includes credit in his models, so they don't include credit.
Doesn't the central bank
No.
also use these models?
But
They use DSG models, but they don't have any role for private debt or credit in them. Stephen might know that better than I do, since you're actually at the central bank occasionally. They're adding what they call financial frictions, aren't they? Yeah, probably. Yeah, because the way neoclassical models make dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models supposedly derive macro from micro. So you have utility maximising households, profit maximising firms, you've got the government inside, then you've got the central bank setting the interest rate. Those are the fundamental parameters of those models. And they assume a return to equilibrium after any disturbance. So any shocks you apply, they then presume the model will be forced back to the time path that gives you equilibrium over time. And whenever they find it they don't fit the data, their argument is there must be frictions that are slowing down the return to equilibrium. So when they didn't see the financial crisis coming, they started to add financial frictions, meaning things in the finance sector that slowed down the return to equilibrium. Now, if you look in the real world, the financial sector isn't a friction, it's a bloody banana skin. You slip on it, it causes things to go faster. So they'll try to fit those things within their paradigm, but that's the dilemma. They have a paradigm that I think is a less accurate model of the economy than the Ptolemaic model was of the universe. So you've got to work really hard to make your model sort of appear to fit the data.
So you've developed your own model of public and private debt. How does it more accurately model financial instability in the economy in general?
Well, that's why I predicted the global financial crisis.
Yeah.
Okay. So like the background there is that I hadn't, I did my model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis in 1992. Okay. I then, the usual workload of an academic, getting lectures written, I finished the thesis in 98, I think. And I then wrote Debunking Economics, so I got involved in that fight. That led to a fight over the theory of the firm, and that sort of finished in 2004. And then in 2005, I got asked to do a expert witness case on a predatory lending. And then I had to look at the data again, and I saw this exponential increase, not in the level of private debt, but the ratio of private debt to GDP. I said, well, that simply can't continue. When it stops rising, there'll be a break. Credit will go from positive to negative, and that'll cause a crisis. So in a heuristic sense, I knew a crisis was inevitable. It's a question, I didn't actually try to time it precisely. So in that sense, because I focus on something the mainstream completely ignores, which is credit, then I saw that crisis coming, and now looking in the aftermath, I don't expect to get a crisis coming out of those particular dynamics, because to have a crisis like that, you've got to have a high level of credit followed by a low level. So like in America, between 1945 and 2007, the annual change in private debt was never negative. It was always positive. It reached a maximum of 15% of GDP. That's how big the increase in credit was in 2006. In 2009, it fell to -5. It went from +15 to -5. That's 20% of GDP change in the level of aggregate demand, which has to cause huge economic disturbances. Now credit's bouncing around at about the 7 to 10% of GDP level, and not necessarily trending up all the time. So you're not going to have the same severe drop. But what Trump is doing right now could easily trigger chaotic breakdowns with bankruptcies. So, I'm hedging my bets on that front.
Well, actually, now that you mentioned Trump, you predicted the last financial crisis. Do you have any predictions for the next one?
I'm not worried about financial crisis anymore. I'm worried about ecological crises. So I think what we're not again, economists, as well as completely stuffing up the model of the macroeconomy, they've also stuffed up the model of global warming. And the nonsense that's been done by William Nordhaus and his fellow travellers, including a Dutch guy, Richard Toll. Richard here? Nah, what a pity. Is the worst garbage I've ever read.
So what are some of the most dangerous flaws about the way that mainstream economics frames climate change?
Well, the neoclassicals got involved in climate change in response to the Limits to Growth study. Have you heard of the Limits to Growth? Published in 1972. Highly recommended reading. And that's the technology they use is the same technology that I use for mathematical modelling. And with different software, but the same technology. And William Nordhaus attacked it, calling it measurement without data and rubbishing their lack of empirical foundations. And then because that sort of pushed that approach out of economics, he substituted his own using what's called a Ramsey growth model in his model called DICE, which stands for Dynamic Integrated Climate and Economy. Now, when he first tried to empirically fit that, he used what he called what they call the enumerative approach. They add up damages they find in physics papers or biology papers and put a price on them. Okay, and that sounds moderately reasonable. Then I read his paper, written in 1991, and he said you can divide the economy into 3 sectors: severely exposed to climate change, moderately exposed, and negligibly exposed. You probably know the answer to this question, but I'll have to tell the others. He put 87% of the economy in negligibly exposed to climate change. It was all of manufacturing, all of wholesale and retail services, all of the government, all of utilities, a couple of exceptions, 87%. And mining, included mining in not sufficiently exposed. Somebody must have tapped them on the shoulder at some stage in 1991 or two and said, "Oh, William, there is open cut mining." So the next time he came up with that prediction, he said underground mining underground mining is negligibly exposed, and rather than 87%, it was 85%. So he literally thinks a roof will protect you from climate change.
Yeah.
Okay. They also do what they call the statistical method, and that says they use data about temperature and GDP across the planet to predict what they think is going to happen to global warming. Now that means that they think that a 7-degree increase in temperature would reduce global GDP by 25%. Okay? Now he talked to climate scientists, they reckon 5 degrees will drive us extinct. Okay? So they're completely divorced from the science literature.
Yeah.
And I've some of the scientists they quote in their papers are friends of mine now. And I read how the economists interpreted the papers and show it to the scientists, and they say, "You're kidding." Okay.
But what happens if you speak to the economists that are writing these papers and you tell them everything you just told us, and you go like, "I don't like this, I think this is wrong." Like, what do they tell you? Are they saying that you're wrong?
Yes, they're saying I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And what do they say then?
Well, they claim that I misinterpreted the paper. So, for example, there's one on tipping points. And to give you an idea of this particular paper, this was published, I think, in 2021 or therearabouts. And they said, looking at a survey of economic studies of tipping points, they said that if we lose the Arctic summer sea ice, Greenland, the West Antarctic ice shelf, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, that matters to us a lot, okay? The Amazon rainforest, ocean methane hydrates, which have enormous amounts of methane in them, permafrost, and the Indian monsoon. So the planet would be visibly different from space. At 6 degrees of warming, that will cause an additional 1.4% damages to GDP. So rather than falling by 8.55, it will fall by about 10%. That's that is delusional. So they're making assumptions that climate change deniers would make, and then modelling what's going to happen to the economy on that basis. And because people, and I thought this myself before I read the literature, I thought they were taking research from climate scientists and then converting it into economic numbers using a high rate of discount. In fact, that was trivial compared to what they do. They make up their own assumptions and they ignore what the scientists write, or they misinterpret it. So in my case, they thought that I said that 1.4% was caused by the increase in temperature. There's just no point talking to them, unfortunately.
So in what way do you more appropriately model the environment and the economy?
Well, you start off by knowing that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the ecology. Okay, the economy only exists if the ecology exists. It's not an externality, it's what we live in. Okay? If you destroy the environment, you destroy the economy as well. That's the organising framework. And then you'd look and say, well, climate scientists would tell us, roughly speaking, what level of increase in temperature can we cope with without breaking down the stability of the ecology on which we've evolved our civilizations. And most of them would say, for God's sake, no more than 1 degree. Okay. Now we're at 1.5 already. Okay. We're on our way to 2 or 3 degrees of warming. And if the thing which, if you've got to look at the long term, I mean like 650 million years of data, okay, to get a good feeling for where we stand at the moment. So we're in a period of the Earth which the temperatures have been declining over time. It'll start rising in a couple of 100 million years, but it's been declining over the last 400 or 500 million years. And we've reached a point where we've been cycled between a glacial period and interglacial. That's been happening for about 1.5 million years. And across that time, roughly speaking, when you're in a glacial period, like the last ice age, temperatures on average are about 6 degrees colder than they were when human civilization began. So you get these, and they're called Milankovitch cycles. They're not smooth, they're very chaotic. It's another wonderful application of chaos theory in terms of the interaction of the Earth's orbit around the sun, how circular it is or elliptical, and then the angle of the planet and so on. But every 100,000 years, you have about a 20,000 year period of rising and then falling temperatures. So there's 10,000 years of high temperatures either side, okay? This particular one we're in right now, the Earth is actually in a very circular orbit, so this particular hot period should go on for about 40,000 years, naturally speaking, okay? So we evolved right at the very top of it, okay? We didn't evolve when it was really cold, okay? We evolved here, and we would intended to go horizontally for that length of time for, say, 40,000 years. Instead, we've gone up 1.5 degrees in a period of time which on geological scales is absolutely instantaneous. The only time you could ever say there's been as fast a change in the temperature of the planet would be when the meteor hit that wiped out the dinosaurs. Okay? It's of that scale. An economist saying, what's the problem? Climate science, what's the problem? Increase the temperature by 1.5 degrees in an absolute instant? That's not going to do anything. Well, my problem is economists have managed to completely silence the climate scientists because most people don't realise the trivial implications like small falls in GDP that have become part of the popular literature is based on the delusional work of economists. So the climate doesn't care what economists think or climate scientists for that matter, but the increase in temperature we've had is going to now, the climate will be having the argument with the climate change deniers, and the most important deniers amongst that are the economists.
So how do you see, for example, your work in environmental economics informing public policy on climate change?
Oh, telling us that it's a maximisation issue, it's optimisation issue.
No, but how would you see your work informing
I'd say
policy?
we've got to be in an absolute war economy. We have to reduce the temperature of the planet back to what it was in pre-industrial periods, and everything has to be done to reduce energy consumption so that we can ultimately wean ourselves off fossil fuels, and we should be doing it absolutely at panic rates. So, it's a sort of, you would have to be rationing like we did in World War II. Not here, obviously, I'm thinking of England. You guys got occupied, okay? But you would be rationing consumption to enable as much as possible of productive capability to go towards attenuating climate change damages before they become catastrophic. That's what should be doing.
So are you also in favour of something like degrowth, but maybe a more extreme version of degrowth?
A more extreme version of degrowth. I mean, if you look at the level of energy consumption that we have at the moment, our energy consumption, about 85% of it comes from fossil fuels, between 80 and 85%. So even all the talk about solar and wind and et cetera, it's still less than 1/5 of the total energy supply. So that means 4/5 of GDP is powered by energy we really shouldn't be using. Okay? And again, even to be able to survive what we're approaching, there are now a number of groups around the world who are trying to work out a way to rapidly cool the planet. There's one called MIR, which stands for Mirrors for Earth's Energy Rebalancing, mir.org. And their idea is to put low-cost mirrors on the surface. They're doing a lot of it in slums in Nigeria and India right now. So you just reflect the solar energy back out into outer space before it can be turned into infrared and heat the planet. But on a huge scale. And if we don't, I think our civilization won't make it to 2050.
That's very soon.
So on that note, maybe we would like to open our stage up for some audience questions for our guest. Are there any?
So there's someone over here.
Yep.
In the middle.
Yeah,
You,
third row from the front.
Firstly, thank you for being here. I have a bit of a simple question because you've been a proponent for the debt Jubilee, right? As a way to address excessive debt, private debt at least.
Yeah.
But doesn't that create a sort of moral hazard where people expect to get the bailout so they go out and get the debt anyway? So how do you square balancing it?
That was, if you look back at history, and that's a very good question, by the way, I appreciate it. If you look back at the early human civilizations, so Sumerian civilization, Egyptian and Roman, early Roman, they had regular jubilees every either 49 years or every time the ruler changed or some major event occurred, and it was mainly forgiving household debt. They didn't forgive commercial debt, but they wrote off all household debt. And they realised there was a tendency for debt to grow exponentially, but productivity to grow and reach a plateau. There are actually Sumerian cuneiforms that show that pattern, like not as a graph, of course, but a set of sequence of symbols. And so they realised the importance of private debt. They said, we've got to eliminate it. Now, rather than that meaning people would drink irresponsibly, because most of the debt was actually run up in mead halls, drinking alcohol during the year. People always knew how to party. It was a sort of sense of liberation for people who'd become debt slaves. So if you lost your farm because you couldn't pay back the mead hall owner, you became a slave working on the mead hall's farm. But you knew at some point you'd be liberated and go back to your land, okay? So it meant there was tension, obviously, in becoming a debt slave, but it wasn't overwhelming. So that's society function. What you do with the idea of a debt jubilee is do one-off reset and eliminate the problem of excessive private debt, but then from that point on put in policy controls that don't allow ludicrous levels of private debt. So one of the obvious ones is limit how much banks can lend to finance buying a house. Now, the main cause of rising house prices is accelerating mortgage debt. Again, when you do that correlation, which is not supposed to exist according to mainstream economics, the correlation between change in new mortgage debt and house price change is about 0.7 to 0.8. So the main thing causing those changes is the amount of money you borrow to buy a house. So if you limited, and this is another proposal as part of that argument that I put forward, I call it the pill. Now, that was funny 40 years ago. Got to be an old bloke like me or Cars to know what the pill stands for. You know? Birth control pill, okay? It's several property property income limited leverage, the pill. So you'd say banks can lend no more than 10 times the rental income for a property. Now that would get rid of the house price bubble, and it would also mean you don't carry a huge amount of debt to buy a house. House prices would be lower. You wouldn't need the debt in the first place. So what you really want to do is have that debt directed towards productive activities. You want debt to be given to corporations for working capital, because they need it, entrepreneurs for new investments, households for large consumption items. That all makes sense. But you don't let them lend outrageous amounts of debt, which only ends up in causing financial bubbles, as we've seen globally for the last 30 or 40 years. So yeah, you need other elements to it. But once you've done that, you would no longer have the obsession people have about borrowing money. Good question.
Perfect. So I see a person over there on the very side.
My question is actually kind of related to the Jubilee part, which is the people who you mentioned before as stupid, who are taking these bad loans and bad debt and putting themselves in positions where they can't get out of them. After taking the pill and limiting their access to capital, how do you propose that these people, who, for example, might take a loan to pay the groceries or something like that?
Well, that's a banker's fault. I mean, you need two parties to any debt, okay? The banks themselves have to extend the credit. I presume most of you have credit cards? Okay. What's the annual rate of interest on your credit cards? 25, 30%? Okay. That's a huge gain for the banks if they actually can get that sort of level of interest out of you. So banks are going to encourage you to take on credit card debt. Okay. Now, when you look at what people actually do at the aggregate level, credit card debt and other forms of unsecured personal debt have rarely exceeded, in America's case, 10% of GDP. What people borrow money for are non-financial assets, houses and shares, that they think are going to go up in value. And those they'll borrow because they think they're going to make a gain in the future. You don't expect the groceries to get more expensive if you get a profit out of buying them cheaply and selling them more expensively. So the part of our psychology that banks exploit to get us to take on more mortgage debt doesn't exist with normal private debt.
Perfect. Thank you for the question. For now, we'll be going back to the interview. So a lot of your models, quite theoretical, right? How do we translate those models actually into policies? We just mentioned a few policies like the Jubilee debt.
Yeah.
Is that also a policy that comes from your model?
Oh, yeah. I mean, for a major part of obviously is limiting how much private debt gets accumulated. You put measures in place that mean you don't get huge bubbles in private debt. To give people an idea, most people aren't aware of the statistics. If you go back to 1945, the level of private debt as a percentage of GDP in America was roughly 50% of GDP. It peaked at 170% in the global financial crisis, so 3.5 times as much debt. Same thing applied in Europe. In Europe, when the euro was established, Spain went from about 50% to 240%. So you eliminate those, and that itself will make the system more stable. But you also get the fact the economy ends up being a complex system. Complex dynamics out of relatively simple rules can give you very complicated dynamic behaviour in the economy. And what you want to avoid is what are called basins of attraction into bad situations. So you would get policy arguments about limiting the level of private debt. You'd also try to get a lower level of income inequality, because the level of income inequality is off the scale in modern society. It's not justified in any economic sense. It's power that leads to those huge imbalances. Crushing trade unions, which trade unions used to bargain for wages. Now you find yourselves working as gig economy workers, and if you want a wage rise, you get sacked. All those weakening the hand of the mass of people, the workers, fundamentally workers and middle class, that's what's led to the instability. That's transferred money to the wealthy. So you'd be talking in terms of designing a society where there's power offsetting systems, where at the moment all the power's gone to the capitalists, not to the workers, and we need to redress that imbalance.
But would you say that your models are developed enough to inform our global policy?
Yeah, I was not, because I've been involved in so many things, the climate change work, building a software package called Ravel. So if you search for the word Ravel, take a look at the program, that's the one we're talking about here. I never got to the stage of building a sophisticated model. And then by sheer happenstance, giving a talk on a live YouTube channel, a guy came on and said that he'd built a model of the pandemic using Ravel. And it's got a capacity to model dynamic functions like the pandemic, and what's called a SEERD model. It stands for susceptible, infected, susceptible, exposed, infected, recovered, dead. Okay? Now that's 5 what are called system states. So this guy says, I've built a model, would you like to see it? Oh yeah, send it to me. My instant reaction when I saw his model, and I quote, was, holy fuck. It 25 system states, incredibly sophisticated, far more sophisticated than anything I've ever built. He's since built a model of the American economy tying together all my approaches to economic modelling. And he was approached by a finance firm to say, can we use this for forecasting? And what they worked out to do, which I think is brilliant, it was a conceptual model, it was not fitted to data, but Ravel exports equations in a language called LaTeX. And an AI can read LaTeX and convert that into Python. And then with Python, they told the AI to change the parameters until such time as it fitted the American data. That model is already outperforming every DSG model on the planet. So it's now being used for market forecasts. So it can be done. And I thought it would take a lot longer, but I can't show the model to you because you'll pay $10,000 to get access to it. But it is possible to model the economy quite well.
Wow, that is quite exciting. So shifting gears a bit, shifting gears a bit, you're kind of known for calling out big-name economists, sometimes even Nobel Prize winners, where you say that their ideas are delusional or nonsense. I'm a bit curious about this approach. Like, has it not worked being a bit more diplomatic, that you're just tired, that you're just tired of it, and then you just say how it is, like you think it's nonsense?
Like, I'm part of in terms of the percentage of the academic profession which is non-orthodox, it's something of the order of 10% of the academic economists, and the ones you don't normally hear about. And if you go back and look at the literature of a neoclassical economist debating with non-orthodox economists, you can find this literature back in the 1920s. Now, we come up with a devastating critique in various times. And my favourite probably is what's called the Cambridge Controversies. Have you heard about them?
I don't think so.
I didn't think so, okay, because you're taught by neoclassicals. They were a controversy over the definition of capital. And Paul Samuelson, you know the name Paul Samuelson, okay, he engaged from MIT, which is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was fighting economists at Cambridge, UK, so it's called the Cambridge Controversies as well. And he at one point said, look, we teach our kids these simple parables. Okay? We know there's no such thing as an isoquant. Okay? They teach this idea about different combinations of capital and labour that give you the same level of output, implying you can smoothly change the ratio of capital to labour in a production process. We know that's a fairy tale. Okay? He called it a parable. Because what actually happens is you've got straight lines connecting labour and capital along a production frontier of a particular technology, and then as you change the price, you get a whole lot of straight lines, and if you look at the combination of all those straight lines, you get a curve. That's where the isoquant comes in. Well, an Italian economist called Garignani then showed that the only way you get that smooth envelope is if the ratio of labour to capital is the same in all industries. Once you allow the ratio of labour to capital differs in different industries, they're no longer straight lines, they're curves. And if you have the curves, you don't get a smooth envelope anymore. You can have a situation where a high rate of interest means one particular technology, a medium rate of interest means another, and a low rate of interest means you go back to the previous technology. It's called re-switching. Now, that so devastated Samuelson that he wrote a paper called A Summing Up, and I highly recommend reading that paper. In the final section, he points out that the critics are right, and he finally says, if all this makes us nostalgic for the old-time parables of neoclassical thought, we must remind ourselves that scholars are not born to live an easy existence. We must appraise and accept the facts of life. Loved him for that. What did he do? Continued teaching the same shit the next 40 years. None of you have even heard about the Cambridge Controversies. So being polite doesn't work, and I thought, fuck it, I'm going to be rude.
So do you think when students like ourselves hear you, be rude, as you've put it, do you think it opens our eyes, or rather, teaches us to dismiss opposing views in the same way that these neoclassical economists dismissed your?
I think it is one thing a lot of my fellow critics say, economics is too important to be left to the economists. What the neoclassicals tell you is leave it to us, we can handle it. I was saying, no, you've had a century and you haven't done it. So you've got to be rude to get the attention. And again, I'll go back to Galileo. He made a bit of a mistake, and maybe I'm making the same one. But when he wrote his main dialogue to try to oppose the Copernican view against the Ptolemaic view, he chose the name of a 12th century, I think it was, astronomer. It happened to be the same name, I think, as the Pope at the same time, and the name was Simplicio. Simpleton. Didn't endear himself to the others, so maybe I'm doing the same thing. But because they won't listen to us, then I was saying, well, we're not going to listen to you either. We're going to rubbish you in public and point out why your ideas are unsound. And that maybe is more effective. I don't know, but certainly being polite for the last century didn't work.
Yeah.
Can you maybe reflect a bit on one of these attacks that you've done on one of these ideas where you're just saying, oh, that was nonsense, but then you kind of go like, well, maybe I was a bit wrong about that?
Not in any of the stuff I've taken on directly, like climate change, for example. To me, it's stunning that intelligent people can be so deluded and technically skillful at the same time. And one of the main critics of this, a guy called Robert Reich back in the 1960s, he talked about graduate programs in economics turning out idiot savants, skilled at technique, but completely divorced from the real world. So when you're taking on what an idiot savant believes, you fairly rarely find that you're going to make a mistake. So, I'm not saying I'm infallible, okay, I'm not going to claim that, but in the areas that I've taken them on in, the evidence is just massively against their argument and in favour of the alternative. I'm not the only person who ever did this. Some of the work I'm championing against them was done in the 1930s. Okay? So they've ignored it for that length of time, and I'm saying, I just can't accept you ignoring it anymore. And a lot of it comes down to that supply curve analysis. There isn't, rising marginal cost doesn't exist. You've got to throw that away. But they don't do it. So, I can't find an area where a neoclassical prediction beat me.
Coming towards the end of our interview, when you think about your legacy, do you think you will be remembered as the Keynes of our generation?
There's some possibility of that. Like, I'm not the only person doing this by any stretch of imagination. There's a journal called the Review of Review of Political Economy, ROPE, edited by a good friend of mine. There's a large community of non-neoclassical economists. I'm going down to a conference in France in July with that same group of people. So there's a large community. I'm probably going to be one of the most prominent of them, but you know, there's no guarantee I'll be remembered. The people I quote who are my heroes, Hyman Minsky being one, Wynne Godley being another, they're remembered in my circle of economics. They've been forgotten in general, which is one reason I named essential elements of my software after Minsky and Goodwin and Godley, to try to make sure they weren't forgotten. So, you know, if the odds are I'll be forgotten like all the other critics.
Who knows? Maybe some of the future students on the model, the Keen model, you'll be remembered.
Okay.
Thank you so much for this interview, Mr. Keen. And I would like a round of applause, please.
Thank you. Okay.